Hey friends, imagine a world where the Chinese yuan is as good as gold. Literally. Every yuan backed by real gold bullion. Every country ditching the dollar. Every headline screaming, the era of the gold backed yuan has arrived. Sounds glorious for Beijing, right? Except it's never going to happen. Because when you peel back the propaganda, the math, the mechanics, and the politics, you realize a gold backed yuan is the financial version of a unicorn. Pretty to fantasize, impossible to write. Let's start with the fantasy. Beijing wants the world to believe the Chinese yuan is destined to dethrone the dollar. They are stockpiling gold, flexing their BRICS currency muscles, and whispering to the world loudly. Maybe we'll back the Chinese yuan with gold. Maybe the dollar's days are numbered. And it's the kind of whisper that gets gold bugs and de-dollarization fanboys drooling. But here's the thing. It is all noise or strategic theater. Because backing a currency with gold isn't just a simple monetary decision. It is a full-scale economic revolution. And China is structurally, mathematically, and politically unfit to pull it off. Let's talk numbers. Because the fantasy of a gold-backed yuan dies the moment you do the math. China's official gold reserves roughly 2,300 tons. Maybe more if you believe the rumors. Sounds huge until you realize that is worth about 200 billion US dollars at current gold prices. Now, compare that with China's M2 money supply, which is over 40 trillion US dollars equivalent. And that means for every yuan in circulation, there's barely 0.5% of gold to back it. It's like calling yourself a billionaire because you found a few coins under the sofa. To make the Chinese yuan credibly convertible into gold, China would need at least 20 to 30 times more gold. Meaning it would have to buy up more than a decade of global gold production. That is not monetary reform anymore. That is global market warfare. The moment Beijing tried this, gold prices would skyrocket. The dollar would strengthen even more because you need dollars to buy gold. And China would be caught in a self-defeating spiral, trying to buy credibility while destroying the affordability of gold. And even if Beijing had the gold, here comes the killer question. Would they actually let anyone redeem it? A gold-backed currency only works if you can convert it. But the Chinese yuan is not even freely convertible into US dollars, let alone physical gold. Foreign investors cannot move funds freely. Chinese citizens cannot wire more than 50,000 US dollars a year abroad. And every cross-border transaction goes through the state's political filter. So imagine a global investor trying to redeem a billion Chinese yuan for gold. You think the People's Bank of China would just smile and hand over gold bullion? Not a chance. They would probably hand you a patriotic responsibility lecture and a stack of red tape thicker than the Great Wall. Let's not forget, this is the same government that froze withdrawals at rural banks from ordinary Chinese citizens and censored protests. If Beijing doesn't even trust its own citizens with cash, do you think it will trust foreigners with gold? A gold-backed Chinese yuan would only be credible if it is convertible, transparent, and rule-based. And China fails all of this. So sure, they could slap gold linked on the brochure, but until a hedge fund manager in London can just walk into a Shanghai bank and swap yuan for gold without needing political permission, that gold backing is a fairy tale with Chinese characteristics. Now, let's assume purely for sport that China somehow pulls it off. They find all the gold they need to back their inflated money supply, announce a shiny new gold yuan standard, and tell the world, every yuan you hold is redeemable for X grams of gold. Congratulations! By doing that, they've just tied a noose around their own economy. Here's why. A gold-backed currency kills monetary flexibility. It means the People's Bank of China can no longer print its way out of trouble. No more easy liquidity for collapsing property developers. No more stealth bailouts for local governments drowning in debt. No more soft landings when exports crash. Every yuan printed must be matched by a fixed amount of gold. That is economic handcuffs. And Beijing's entire growth model so far has been built on the opposite, which is endless credit expansion. Remember how China survived 2008? They injected 4 trillion yuan overnight, flood the system with liquidity. Remember how they cushioned Evergrande's collapse? They flooded the banking system with cheap loans. Under a gold standard, that playbook dies. If capital flees and people demand gold redemption, the PPOC cannot just print confidence or print gold. They would have to raise interest rates, cut credit, or dump gold reserves. The exact opposite of what Beijing's political machine wants to do. And think about what happens domestically. China's economy is heavily leveraged. Corporate debt over 160% of GDP. Local government hidden debt around 9 trillion US dollars. Locking your currency to gold while your system depends on debt, it's like handcuffing yourself. And here's the bigger irony. China's leadership thrives on control. not on rules. A gold standard, however, is the ultimate rule-based system. It tells the central bank, you can't cheat. But cheating, massaging data, printing stimulus, bending the rules, is the Chinese system. So a gold-backed Chinese yuan is not just economically unworkable. It is politically suicidal for the CCP. It means surrendering monetary control to a lump of metal that doesn't care about party congresses or social stability. And if you think Xi Jinping, the guy who eliminated term limits, is going to hand over monetary power to gold, you haven't been paying attention and you don't know who Xi Jinping is. Also, even if China had the gold and the willingness, it still wouldn't have the trust, because reserve currencies are not built on metal. They are built on credibility, deep capital markets, legal transparency, rule of law. Things China simply doesn't have and cannot fake. The US dollar dominates not because it is a flawless currency, but because it is the most trusted. The world knows that if you hold dollar reserves, you can spend them anywhere, anytime, under a relatively predictable system. Now imagine trying that with the Chinese yuan. Opaque reserves, sudden capital controls, political risk, confiscation, and a government that might just freeze your assets, the second you tweet something unharmonious. The yuan doesn't need more gold. It needs more trust. And that trust cannot be mined. In other words, China would have to become everything it currently is not. Open, transparent, trusted. That is not simply a monetary reform we're talking about. That is regime change. And here's what most people miss when they talk about gold-backed money. Gold is not just a metal. It is a limit. And limits are the one thing the Chinese Communist Party cannot tolerate. A gold standard ties the value of money to something outside government control. It means you can't quietly devalue your currency to bail out your cronies at the state-owned enterprise. You can't print your way through policy failures and then blame external factors. Gold is the enemy of central planning because it's honest money. It exposes lies, punishes waste, and rewards monetary discipline. And that is precisely why Beijing will never truly back their currency with gold. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't want sound money. It wants obedient money. Money that obeys their political orders, their GDP targets, not market rules. Under a gold standard, savers can protect their wealth from inflation. Investors can move money freely, when they lose confidence. Citizens can measure the real value of their currency, and by extension, the real competence of their leaders. That is economic freedom. And you know that CCP sees any type of freedom not as a feature, but as a threat to their rule. If China went on a real gold standard, the yuan wouldn't just gain credibility abroad, it would also empower its citizens at home. The last thing the CCP wants. And that is the nightmare scenario for Beijing. A population that doesn't depend on the party to preserve its wealth. Think about it. Gold doesn't obey CCP censorship. The moment a currency is tied to gold, truth enters the system. And truth is the one thing China's rulers fear the most. So while the rest of the world talks about, monetary competition between yuan and the dollar and, the de-dollarization movement, how yuan will replace the dollar, the real issue here isn't economics. It's control. A gold-backed yuan would mean CCP surrendering part of that control to markets, to math, and to reality itself. And in Xi Jinping's China, reality is only allowed when it serves the party narrative. So no, the CCP won't go gold-backed because gold represents freedom and the party represents fear of freedom. Now, does that mean China will stop trying? No. They'll still push the Chinese yuan for trade settlements, build offshore yuan centers, and hoard gold as a symbolic weapon. They might even roll out a half-backed version for friendly countries, BRICS, Belt and Road partners, etc. But that is a regional workaround, not a global monetary revolution. At best, they nibble at the dollar's edges. At worst, they fool their own citizens into thinking that the Chinese yuan is gonna replace the dollar and, backed by gold, while the system stays just as closed. So the next time you see headlines screaming about China's gold-backed yuan and how it will replace the dollar, remember this. Until Beijing is ready to open its markets, free its currency, and accept the chaos that comes with transparency, the yuan will stay what it has always been, a state-controlled monopoly money, IOU that the Chinese central bank can print at will. Because you can't back a currency with gold when your entire system is backed by fear.